bringing you law, gospel, and guns. This is Armed Lutheran Radio.
And welcome to Armed Lutheran Radio, Episode 4. I am your host, Lloyd Bailey, the Armed Lutheran. Today's episode is brought to you by Cook's Holsters, American-made custom Kydex holsters with a 100% satisfaction guarantee. CooksHolsters.com. Well, before we get started, let's get a few announcements out of the way. First off, Armed Lutheran Radio can now be found on iTunes, Stitcher, and TuneIn. Be sure to look for us and subscribe to your favorite service. Want to give a little shout out, a little thank you to the Reverend Ken Blanchard for his advice in getting things started on Armed Lutheran Radio. And be sure to check out Ken's podcast, Black Man with a Gun, at blackmanwithagun.com, or you can find him on iTunes or Stitcher Radio as well. I want to thank those of you who responded to an email I sent out recently. We're going to start a contest pretty soon here on the show where contestants will be brought on, asked a series of questions about guns, and we'll be competing for the chance to win some cool prizes. If you're interested in playing, be sure to send me an email at armedlutheranradio@gmail.com. For those who've already expressed an interest, I'll be sending you details soon, so look for that. And finally, I want to send out well wishes. Our thoughts and prayers go out to the family of Pastor John Bennett of St. John Lutheran Church in Willow Creek, Minnesota. Pastor Bennett was scheduled to join us today, but an illness in his family interrupted our plans. Please keep him and his son Benjamin in your prayers. Lord willing, we will have Pastor Bennett on with us next week for an interesting segment that we have planned on a weekly basis. I think you're really going to enjoy. So our thoughts and prayers to Pastor Bennett, his wife, and their son Benjamin. Hope he feels better soon. Okay, on today's show, we've got some fun stuff lined up. Thoughts on the election, particularly Ron Paul's comments about Ted Cruz. Some feel-good news from the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals on the Maryland assault weapons ban. A range review of the Canik-55 Stingray-C. A look back at a day in the mountains shooting with my dad. And Sergeant Bill joins us again with tips on improving your draw speed. That's all straight ahead on Armed Lutheran Radio.
Pistols, prayer, and potluck. You're listening to Armed Lutheran Radio.
Well, this week's feel-good news story comes from the New York Daily News. Federal court deals blow to gun reformers, saying people have, quote, fundamental right to own assault weapons in rejection of Maryland law. A federal court said that assault weapons are in such common use that owning them is a fundamental right in a decision that could force the Supreme Court to rule on whether the firearms are legal. On Thursday, a 3-judge panel dealt a blow to anti-gun advocates. They call them anti-gun violence advocates, but let's face it, they are anti-gun advocates, when they rejected portions of a Maryland gun reform law. The legislation was passed following the Sandy Hook massacre, which claimed the lives of 20 children and 6 adults. The shooter, whose name I will not mention, used an AR-15 style semi-automatic quote-unquote assault rifle. Then Maryland Governor Martin O'Malley, who recently threw in the towel on his bid for the presidency because he had absolutely zero chance of winning, signed the Firearms Safety Act in May of 2013, which banned so-called assault weapons and magazines that had more than 10 rounds, and required all gun buyers to submit digital fingerprints to police. The law was signed in conjunction with similar gun reforms in Connecticut and New York following the Newtown shooting. And a federal appellate court upheld both of those laws. But in a 2-1 decision by a 3-judge panel, the Federal Circuit Court upheld the portion of the law which would require fingerprinting, a now commonplace practice in states like New York, but sent back pieces of the law that would ban so-called assault weapons. The law will be sent back to a district court, which will have to apply stricter constitutional standards to its review. Provisions that outlaw weapons would substantially burden this fundamental right to bear arms, and that they are in common use by law-abiding citizens, Chief Judge William Traxler wrote in his decision. President of Marylanders to Prevent Gun Violence, Vincent DeMarco, told the Daily News, "Assault weapons are not included under the right to bear arms. Our bazookas, our tanks, our machine guns? Of course not," he fumed. I can't believe they added the words "he fumed." The NRA hailed the decision. Maryland's ban on commonly owned firearms and magazines clearly violates our fundamental individual right to keep and bear arms for self-defense, said Chris Cox, the executive director of the NRA's Institute for Legislative Action, adding that the federal court's decision was an important victory for the Second Amendment. Maryland Attorney General Brian Frosch said he would appeal the decision, and that it conflicts sharply with the rulings of other federal appellate courts. The Supreme Court will almost certainly now have to resolve this dispute, according to Professor James Jacobs, the director of New York University's Law School Center for Research in Crime and Justice. It's unclear whether Frosch will appeal to a full 15-member Fourth Circuit Court or whether he will take it to the Supreme Court. If it doesn't ultimately get to the Supreme Court, it highlights just how important this upcoming election is going to be, because whoever wins may be naming 2, 3, maybe even 4 members of the Supreme Court. And let's not forget that the Heller and McDonald decisions were decided by a single vote. So this is an important election, to be sure. This is an important decision for gun rights and for defense of the Second Amendment. So congratulations to Marylanders for now, and kudos to Chief Judge William Traxler for his brave decision on this, recognizing what a substantial burden O'Malley's law has placed on the people of Maryland, and we'll just have to see how this works out. But for now, it's good news. We continue to fight in the courts, and we continue to win.
Help support Armed Lutheran Radio. Visit www.patreon.com/armedlutheran and become a sponsor today.
For many Americans, there are fond memories of growing up and going shooting with your dad. Well, for me, those memories are very different. My dad is not what you'd call a rugged outdoorsman. Sure, he'd hike to the top of a hill in search of some forgotten family cemetery, but he's not exactly Bear Grylls. He's got a small collection of firearms, but they're historical pieces mostly, not modern defensive or hunting weapons. He's not a hunter. He wasn't the person who taught me how to shoot. He wasn't the one who taught me about gun safety. In fact, we never went shooting together ever until I was in my 40s. Like I said, Dad's not a gun guy. He's got family heirloom flintlock rifles. He's got an old single-shot .22 that he was given as a boy, which he has since passed on to my son. He's got a World War II German Luger pistol, which he always carried in his glove box. And he's got a World War II British Enfield rifle. Well, one day, what was it? I guess it was back in 2012. We decided to go shooting up in the mountains with him, and we stopped at the local gun store on the way. We grabbed a box of .303 shells for the infield, and then we headed up the hill to my grandfather's house. Once there, we had pasted a couple of reactive targets onto some cardboard boxes and staked them out into the cow pasture. Don't worry, the cow pasture was empty. The cows had been carted off to auction, and they'd left us a nice big muddy field full of landmines to navigate, if you know what I mean. Now, your dad is supposed to be teaching you, not the other way around, right? Most people, their memories of shooting with their dad are of their dad teaching them how to handle the gun and the safety rules. I, on the other hand, found myself in the very uncomfortable position of having to teach my elderly father the basics of firearm safety, and then being completely ignored. Before we began, my son and I were putting our eyes and ears on. I brought extra foam earplugs to share, and my father and my brothers waved them off. No need, they assured me. My son and I kind of looked at each other. The look on my son's face was priceless, actually. I wish I could have taken a picture. I recited to them the 8th commandment of gun safety, which you can find on my website. I've conveniently taken the rules of gun safety and compiled them in sort of a 10 commandments format. The 8th commandment is to always wear eye and ear protection. No need, my father assured me. Done this many a time, he told me. I did manage to convince my brothers to take a pair of earplugs and a spare pair of protective glasses, but never could convince my dad. So we started plugging away with my son's Christmas present, which was a tactical Ruger 1022 and a couple of handguns that I brought. The targets were a little bit far away for us to hit consistently with the handguns, and we didn't really want to get out into the middle of the pasture amongst the cow pies, so we shot from the far edge of the pasture, which made it kind of a tough shot. So Dad convinced me that, well, he didn't convince me. He was convinced that there was a better place to set up and shoot. He'd done this many times, apparently, and that was to take an old milk jug and cut the bottom out of it, and to place that on top of a metal fence post that rings the pasture on the other side of the road. Think about that one for a moment. He'd done this many a time, he told me, firing across a paved county road at a target sitting on top of a metal post. So, I then had to recite my 4th commandment of gun safety, which is basically the 4th rule, right? Always be sure of your target and what's beyond it. His next suggestion was to set targets on some concrete watering troughs in that same pasture, again with the intention of shooting across the road. After reciting the 4th commandment for what must have been the 100th time, I finally convinced him that shooting across the road was a bad idea. So we proceeded to empty our magazines from the edge of the pasture and then returned to the front porch of my dad's cabin to reload. There, my dad surprised me yet again. He loaded up his own Ruger 1022. I didn't realize he had one. He propped it on the porch rail for stability and then began whizzing rounds downrange at our original targets, essentially through the limbs of a tree which was right next to the porch. I repeated Commandment 4 again and again and again, to the point that I was sure I was just talking to myself. Probably because he didn't have any ear protection and couldn't hear anymore. So, out came the big gun, the Enfield .303. Well, I'd never fired anything at that point in a rifle. I'd never fired anything larger than a .22. So I was excited to give it a try. And after doing so, I'm even more in awe of the generation of men who carried that weapon into battle. But my dad's turn came, and he proceeded to muzzle everyone repeatedly. Even though it was unloaded, Now, he never muzzled us with the thing loaded, but it became obvious that he was rather cavalier about the first rule, which is, Commandment 1, treat every gun as if it's loaded. And never point a gun at anything you're not prepared to destroy. That would be Commandment 2. He was convinced, well, hey, I know this thing is unloaded, so it's safe. And I kept repeating this to him over and over and over again. No, Dad, you can't do that. You have to treat every gun as though it's loaded, even if you know it's not. I kept reminding him about the muzzle, and at one point it became so obvious that even my own brother, my younger brother, who is not a gun guy at all, commented on it. So I don't know how many times I repeated Commandments 1 and 2. I got to shoot my dad's Luger, which I'd never done before. It's an interesting gun, obviously. If you've never shot one, it's awkward to charge, to say the least. The recoil, obviously, is manageable. Being an old, heavy, all-steel gun, my dad claims it's exceptionally accurate. But I think he said he could hit the aforementioned milk jug at something like 100 yards, but my dad's prone to exaggeration. Unfortunately, this particular gun is showing its age a bit, and the magazines tend to stick in the mag well, which forces him to remove the grip panels, the original, I think they're pearl grip panels, so that you can eject the magazines out. Well, my dad then performed this maneuver and violated Commandment 2 repeatedly, muzzling people all over the place as he worked on the grip panels. He waved the muzzle around the room as if he'd just heard nothing I'd been saying for the last 2 hours. At one point, my son ducked under a coffee table. Days spent shooting with and learning from your father are fond memories that many American children will cherish for a lifetime. I never got those memories, those moments as a child. Mine came at age 42. This was my moment, and I'll never forget it. Not so much for the shooting, but more for the realization of just how much I had learned on my own over the years and had passed on to my own son. And for all of the praying that we did that day, praying that we would not get shot. If you carry a gun for personal protection, it's imperative that you get a good holster. Now, when I started out, I had no idea what that meant until I found Cook's Holsters at cooksholsters.com. Try their inside the waistband holster with the adjustable clip, or the Comfort series, which can be worn inside or outside the waistband. I own both, and they're the most comfortable holsters I have ever owned. Available in lots of colors, including custom printed Kydex, Cook's holsters are made in the USA. They come with a 100% lifetime warranty against defects and a 100% satisfaction guarantee. Visit www.cooksholsters.com and use the promo code ARMEDPODCAST and get 15% off everything in the store. Dealer opportunities are available. Look, you put a lot of money into the gun that you choose to carry every day, so choose the best holsters available at cooksholsters.com. Welcome back to Armed Lutheran Radio. It's time for another Ballistic Minute with Sergeant Bill. Today, Sarge comes to us from his mobile studio with tips for improving your draw times.
Now, if you're a competition shooter or you're doing this for concealed carry, it all pretty much is the same. It's a little more important if you're practicing to do it to save your life. The biggest thing you need to work on is try to get less moving parts. Now, there's many different techniques on how to do the draw. 3-step, 4-step, 6-step, 15-step, 20-step. Those are all well and good to learn the draw. Once you have learned your draw, you need to start slimming down those steps, combining them so that you have less steps, less to think about, and it all becomes one fluid motion. I try to think of 3 different moves on my draw. First move is my strong hand to my gun in the holster, where I grab, get my master grip, my firing grip. The second step, I'm going to draw the gun out, and my support hand is going to be almost ready to take the 2-hand grip. The third step, my support hand grasps the gun as I'm extending out and prepping the trigger. Most people are worried about what to do with their weak hand during the draw through these steps. I try not to worry too much about what my weak hand is doing. I just want to make sure that it moves at the same time as my strong hand and is ready to make a 2-handed grip. Some instructors will say that your weak hand needs to slap your stomach or be at your belt or as close to the holster as can be. As long as it is in a position that you feel comfortable that you can accept the gun in your strong hand and make a 2-handed grip as you extend to fire, then that's all that really matters. One of the quickest ways to improve your draw times is to get a faster reaction to the timer. You can do this if you have a shot timer by putting the shot timer on your holster or on your belt where your holster would be and set the beep for a random beep. And when you hear that beep, slap the holster with your gun hand. You'll get a really good idea of how fast you're getting to your gun. If you don't have a shot timer and you have a smartphone, you can download an app that's like a shot timer, and you can set a par time on it for, say, 0.4 of a second. The beep is going to be about 0.2 of a second on each end of that. So if you can get to your gun before that second beep, you'll be doing pretty good. Most people, when they hear the timer, they listen to the entire beep and then move. It's not a conscious thing. It's just subconsciously, most people don't react at the instant they hear it. After you've gotten pretty comfortable with your draw and you feel like it's somewhat ingrained and pretty smooth, you can break it down and practice each part. The first part is you can practice a reaction like we talked about earlier, just getting your firing grip. The second thing you could do is you can really just work on that, pulling it from the holster, getting your firing grip and just pulling it, just breaking it out of the holster from the beep. The third thing you can do is drawing it out to your support hand. And then the last thing you can really work on is your press out, where the gun's already cleared the holster and you meet your support hand and you press out to your sights position. That press out movement, if you practice that, will give you the most improvement in overall speed and times. The reason for that is because if you're quicker to your sights, if you're prepping the trigger as you're prepping it out and you've already got the sights where they need to be, you can be quicker to breaking that first shot. Just practicing the extension to fire will speed you up more than anything else in improving your draw times, because as soon as the gun comes out, the instant it's on target, you can break that shot. Always remember, though, there's only one draw per stage if you're a competitor. So fast draws are not really as important for speeding up or getting better times. If you're just a concealed carrier, that fast draw can be very important. But the most important thing is getting the gun out quickly, smoothly, and getting that first shot accurately. This has been Sergeant Bill's Ballistic Minute.
Faith, firearms, freedom. This is Armed Lutheran Radio.
How does it work?
I know not, my liege.
Consult the Book of Armaments.
Armaments, Chapter 2.
Okay, I'm out here at the range today, evaluating the Canik-55 Stingray-C. Now, I'm Southern, so mispronouncing things is in my DNA. So I've heard it pronounced Canik, I've heard it pronounced Canik, I've heard it pronounced Janik. I got used to pronouncing it Canik, and that's what I'm sticking with. So Canik-55 also manufactures TriStar line of guns, and I own a TriStar. This Stingray is a clone of the CZ75 P01, which is the compact version of the CZ75 SP01. Now, for a while, Canik-55 was marketing and selling these guns under their own name here in the US, and then for some reason they decided to stop. The Canik-55 guns have become harder and harder to find, particularly the Stingray-C. There is a TriStar version of this gun. It's called the P100. And the difference between the P100 and the Stingray-C is that originally the Stingray, well, the slide serration's one thing. The Stingray, or the P100 has wider slide serrations. It has slide serrations on the front of the slide. The slide cuts are a little different. The slide is a little more tapered in the TriStar. The grip panels are a little different, but for the most part, the guns are identical. The Canik-55 gun, the Stingray-C, is also ambidextrous, and it was originally shipping with fully adjustable rear sights, adjustable for windage and elevation. Ships with 2 Metgar 15-round magazines, and I have a Stingray, or I have a TriStar P120 that I'm also shooting today. And one thing that I've noticed, I mean, they're very similar. One thing that I've noticed that's different. The Canik-55 has the Stingray has a loaded chamber indicator on the top of the slide. Now, this thing was bathed in grease when I bought it. Unlike the TriStar, which is sold, which is marketed here in the U.S. under the TriStar name. I assume they're assembled here in the U.S. When I bought it, it did not have the same issue with grease. I'm assuming that the Canik probably came straight from the factory in Turkey, because it was coated in cosmoline. So I had to clean that up, and when I did, the loaded chamber indicator on the top of the slide, it says indicator, and it has an outline of a bullet, and that was in white, and that all when I degreased it, that all came off, so it's now black, which I actually like better. Both guns have similar serrations on the top of the slide to cut down on glare. The Canik is fully ambidextrous. It has an ambidextrous safety and an ambidextrous slide release, which I like. One thing that I find interesting, though, the Canik-55, the Stingray, has a really stiff safety, where the TriStar gun really is easy to work with. That safety is not nearly as stiff. It's not as slick as a CZ, but it is still a lot easier to manipulate. The Canik is just very, very, very stiff. The barrels are a little bit different. And I'm basing this on the P120 that I've got, but the P100 is a smaller version. The barrel is black in the TriStar version. It is a chrome barrel in the Canik-55, which I like the look of. The hammers are very similar. It's a single double, but no decocker, external extractor. Of course, it's got the same CZ lines and the same CZ ergonomics. It feels really good in the hand. It's got a nice weight to it, and of course the internal slide rails that make it handle so much easier. I found it's really, really accurate, really pleasant to shoot. The downside is that safety is just so hard to manipulate. Trigger pull is crisp. Single action is nice. Got a little bit of creep in it, or a little bit of take up. Then you hit a wall, and then a nice crisp break. Double action is really stiff, but I'm never going to carry this in double action. I don't recommend you do it either, because to do it you would have to lower the hammer on a loaded chamber, and I don't think that's a real smart idea. Slide serrations are different on the Canik-55. It's got thinner slide serrations, deeper cut slide serrations at the back of the slide, and there are none on the front. And you've got the Canik-55 logo and the dolphin in the grip panels, as opposed to the TriStar logo on the grip panels of the P100. So I'm gonna take this out and shoot it. We'll see how it goes, and see how this thing does. I really like it so far, but give you a little more information here in just a few minutes after I put a few more rounds down range. All right, here we are on the range. The magazines are interesting. They're made by Met-Gar. It says made in Italy, Met-Gar on the front strap of the magazine. They hold 15 rounds. It says Canik Compact 9mm on one side and Canik Compact 40 Smith & Wesson on the other. So this magazine works in both models. And I'm going to assume that this same magazine works in both the TriStar version, since they're basically identical guns. All right, let's give this thing a go. Load it up. And that, I tell you, that safety is just so stiff. You got ambidextrous slide lock and safety, and I'll try it weak-handed here in just a moment. See what we can do here. Very nice trigger. Very big, very bright 3-dot sights. It's got a Novak rear with a slanted rear sight, so it's snag free. So you could carry this, but the sight picture is really nice. Got a visible. It's not really visible. It's visible from the side. It's not visible from the front, the loaded chamber indicator. Recoil is easily manageable. You're talking about a very compact, about a Glock 19 size gun, but with an all steel frame in a CZ design. Magazines drop free, which is a nice feature. Let's try it weak-handed. Yeah, that's safety. Woo. But the nice thing about that safety, if you have to do weak-handed shooting, is, and I can't hit this. Yeah, I'm flinching it. There you go. The gun's accurate. It's me. There we go. The nice thing is, that you could easily, with the ambidextrous controls, you could you could shoot a weak hand stage and still have that safety on the weak hand side, and disengage it and then engage the target, and then drop your magazine and reload. Now I'm trying this is a 14 round Metgar CZ75 compact magazine that came with it came with a Tanfolio BTA 90 that I own, and it works perfectly. Perfect. Absolutely perfect. I really like this gun. If I could just break in that, and it's starting to loosen up. The safety's starting to loosen up a little bit. So with more work, that safety is, I can't work it. I can't work it with one hand yet without canting the gun. But with a little bit of working and a little breaking in, I think that safety will finally start to work and get a little more smooth. I really like this. The problem is, though, if you're going to buy one, I don't know where you're going to find it. I found mine at Precise Shooter in Seattle. I did an interview with the owner recently. You can find that interview on episodes 2 and 3 of the podcast. And he had these guns shipped to him early on by, I guess, EAA. And so he may have a couple left. If you're interested, get in touch with Precise Shooter at PreciseShooter.com. Really like that gun, and so if you can find one, I would recommend it. Check the show notes for specs and photos of the gun from today's shoot.
And the Lord did grin, and the people did feast upon the lambs and sloths and carp and anchovies and orangutans and breakfast cereals and fruit bats and large...
Give a bit, brother.
Remember, Armed Lutheran Radio comes with a 100% satisfaction guarantee. If you are not completely satisfied, the next episode is free.
So I come across this article by Eliza Collins in Politico. Ron Paul says Ted Cruz is no libertarian. Well, now that Rand Paul is out of the race for the White House, his father Ron, who ran in 2008 and 2012, isn't impressed by Ted Cruz's attempts to pick up the free market libertarian banner. You take a guy like Cruz, people are liking the Cruz, they think he's for the free market, and in reality he's owned by Goldman Sachs. I mean, he and Hillary have more in common than we would have with either Cruz or Trump, or any of them, so I just don't think there's much picking, Paul said of the Texas senator on Fox Business News' Varney and Company last Friday. Surprisingly, the elder Paul seems more attracted to the views of Bernie Sanders, who is giving Hillary Clinton a run for her money in the Democratic primary. On occasion, Bernie comes up with libertarian views when he talks about taking away crony capitalism on Wall Street. So in essence, he's right, and occasionally he voted against war, the former Texas congressman said when asked if there was a candidate who was truly for the free market. Now, when I read this, it made me think about 2012. Back then, Obama's running for re-election, and Ron had just dropped out of the race. We're in the middle of a very heated Republican primary. There's way too many candidates. They're all beating each other up. And Paul finally dropped out. He had no chance of winning. And I had a discussion with a friend who is a very good friend of mine who is very active in state and local politics in Washington State. And I asked him if he thought that the Ron Paul libertarian wing of the party would rally behind the eventual nominee. It turned out to be Mitt Romney. Would they kind of, hold their nose and vote for whoever the nominee was in order to stop Obama? And my friend was more optimistic than I was. He thought, yeah, they would put the country first and they would vote for the eventual nominee, whoever it was. It turned out to be Mitt Romney, and we all know how that turned out. Unfortunately, Ron Paul's supporters stayed home. I have lots of friends that I grew up with, who I went to high school with, who are Ron Paul guys, and they would rather stay at home than vote for a rich guy. They preferred to pat themselves on the back and puff their chest up and act like they are somehow morally superior because they refused to vote for Mitt Romney and would rather flush the country down the toilet for 4 more years and give us Obama. Unleashed, lame duck, to do his worst for 4 more years. 4 million Republican voters stayed home, and we got 4 more years of Obama. Thanks. For nothing. So now senile old Ron is back at it again. In this interview, he doesn't think that Ted Cruz is palatable to libertarians. See, Cruz took out a loan from Goldman Sachs back in 2012 when he was running for Senate. Rather than put his entire, family's, everything his family owned, his home, his entire life, rather than put it all in jeopardy to run for Senate, he took out a loan from Goldman Sachs. And, of course, he ultimately won, and apparently he has paid that loan back. To Ron, that means he's bought and paid for by Goldman Sachs. So, Paul's son, Rand, of course, just recently dropped out of the race. And he tends to be from the same cloth as his dad. He tends to voice the same sort of isolationist nonsense and blame America first crap that his dad was famous for. He doesn't dotter on about the Fed and sound money the way his dad does, but he's got his own set of personality quirks that I find tremendously annoying. There's a lot I like about his positions, but when things aren't going well for him, he's very snarky. And a lot of his responses in the debates have been the kind of thing that, you just want to, when your teenager does it, it's just, you want to reach through the TV set and just throat punch him. And now that he's out of the race, the question comes up again. What are the Rand Paul, libertarian, isolationist, terrorists hate us because we meddle in their business wing of the party? What are those people going to do? The Alex Jones tinfoil hat types, what are they going to do? Who are they going to vote for? Or are they going to stay home again and give us Hillary Clinton? And if they do, what then? I mean, we know what Hillary wants. We know what she thinks of you and me. We know what she thinks of the NRA, what she thinks of gun owners. She publicly confessed in the debates that she's proudest of the enemies that she's made, and her number one enemy is the NRA. She opposes our gun rights. She hates us. She's floated the idea of appointing Barack Obama to the Supreme Court. We know that the next president's going to get 2, 3, maybe 4 Supreme Court nominees. She said in town halls multiple times that the Australian style, the Australian approach of government buybacks of weapons, which is confiscation, is a plan that we should consider here in the U.S. I really hope my fellow Americans are not so stupid as to allow this to happen, but I've been wrong before. And just in case, we better prepare for the worst. And by worst, I mean excrement hitting the rotating blades kind of worst. Second Amendment obliterated kind of worst. Door-to-door confiscation kind of worst. Civil war kind of worst. And after reading this quote from Ron Paul, I'm certainly preparing for the worst. Because if Hillary Clinton wins the presidency, we're no longer going to be America. It's going to be Banana Republic time. Because an alleged felon will become president of the United States. An avowed opponent of the Second Amendment will become president of the United States. And the real reason for that amendment, the one we keep reminding the anti-gunners about, it's not for hunting, it's not for self-defense, it's for defense against tyranny. That's what we'll be facing. And we'll be needing that Second Amendment for sure. There's something for you to think about this November. And that's going to wrap it up for this episode. Thank you for listening. Thank you for downloading and subscribing. I hope you'll join us again next time for another episode of Armed Lutheran Radio.
Be sure to visit our website at www.armedlutheran.com. Be sure to follow us on Twitter @ArmedLutheran and like us on Facebook at www.facebook.com/TheArmedLutheran. You can contact us by email at armedlutheranradio@gmail.com or leave us a voicemail at 855-54-ARMED. Thank you for listening to Armed Lutheran Radio.